Thank you very much for having me. I don't think any journalists will have anything to ask me, so I think we're fairly safe there. Thank you for the intro. I think that's most of what I've done. I was just saying, just a potted history on my career. Unfortunately, it's 20 years now of working in the news, including doing policy at first. So I did health and education. I was policy editor at The Observer. And then since I've been in the parliamentary lobby, I've jumped from The Observer to The Times to Sky News. I did have that amazing little stint at the Washington Post, which was particularly exciting because I was just a cub reporter, really, and they said to me, would you mind going to interview this up-and-coming senator, Barack Obama? I kid you not. And so that's the highlight of my career. Although one admission of very, very bad mistake that I made there, I forgot to press record on my dictaphone, and actually afterwards had to ask his press advisor to send me his tape of the interview. So how not to be a journalist. And I've also worked, so at Sky I did the Tory campaign in 2015, so I was on the bus with David Cameron as a journalist, not as a Tory, or of any political party. And I loved stepping back for a bit. I was political editor at The Guardian in a job share, which I'm evangelical about job shares. And then I absolutely loved doing my podcast for 3 years. I was presenter and helped to launch Today in Focus. And I'm now a super fan listening to the new presenters who are amazing. But since I've been back at ITV since last year in the lobby, it's been very, very good fun. Although when I got back, I thought, okay, I've missed all the turbulence. I've missed Brexit. I've missed COVID. We're in for a little bit more of a boring period, a bit back to the kind of 2008-9 times. So the fact that we're sitting here in May 2022, and I've just written it down, we've got 100 fines in Downing Street, including the Prime Minister. We've got a police investigation into Keir Starmer. We're on the brink of a trade war with the EU. We've got a real war in Europe, and we've got a cost of living crisis that's about to tip us into potential recession. I wouldn't have believed it a year ago that we'd be here now. And what I just want to talk a bit about, and then I'll take any questions, is what politically does that mean? Like, where are the parties now politically? And I think the best way to do that is using the local elections. So big caveat, local elections are not the same as general elections. They're not a perfect read across. In fact, in 2019, although the Conservative leader changed, so it's quite a big thing, in the local elections that year, the Tories and Labour were neck and neck on vote share on 28%. And as we know, Boris Johnson got 44% to Jeremy Corbyn's 32% in the general election and absolutely trounced them. In those local elections, 1 in 5 people voted Lib Dem. That was halved at the general election. So they're not perfect, but if you like crunching data, which I do, they're about as good as you get midterm in terms of how the parties are doing. So in terms of England, the narrative has been that this was an election of two halves. I think that narrative slightly overdoes it, and I'll tell you why in a bit, but there definitely was a difference between the south of England and the Midlands and North. And let me just talk about the south, because I've been having chats with MPs from places like Kent, Hampshire, London, Somerset, further down into the southwest, and they are distraught, like really, really distraught. This was a very, very bad result for the Conservative Party. Nobody expected it to be 485 losses across England, Wales and Scotland. The worst, we had predictions last week from a load of experts, the worst anyone said was 325. And many of those were in the south, where, remember, most Tory MPs are. Now, lots of them were at this garden party in Downing Street the other day. When was it? I feel like all time has just gone into a weird warp, but it was only a couple of days ago. They got invited, on the Queen's Speech Day, they got invited to a party in Downing Street, and Southern MPs told me they were talking to each other, they were sharing stories, and they were miserable. They said the doorstep response across the south of England was terrible, and that Boris Johnson in particular was coming out as a disaster. Now, but they were talking to some in the Red Wall, so there was definitely some truth to this two halves thing. He was saying he's still a rock star where we are, and there definitely was a different story in the North and Midlands. But, you know, like I say, most Tory MPs are in the South, and they would say, what is the Conservative Party if it isn't holding up in the south of England? I mean, many people would say, what is the Labour Party if it isn't holding up in the North and the Midlands? So both of the big parties have problems here. What does all that mean? Well, senior MPs and ministers I was talking to were saying people are despairing. They think they're going to lose their seats, quite a few of them. But they're not about to make a move on Boris Johnson right now. Not totally sure why they think that. I think partly that there isn't an obvious replacement, partly that we've come a long way from his most difficult period in January where it really felt febrile. I mean, there were MPs saying to me, it's time for a managed exit for Boris Johnson, who since then have been brought round by Number 10 to our cameras in Central Lobby to go out and bat for the Prime Minister. So the turnaround since January is pretty extraordinary. I mean, that's partly just time going on. I think it's partly that they see Partygate as a kind of vendetta that they think is being run by Dominic Cummings. I think it's far more complicated than that, but they don't want that to be the reason that Boris Johnson goes. I think they think he's done really well in Ukraine. And I think that the local election results they see as quite mixed, so it's not 100%. Gosh, we can't have him. That said, there's a couple of difficult things coming up, and one of them is the Tiverton by-election, which is a 24,000 majority, and anyone who's near that election will tell you is looking very bad for the Conservatives. I think I just saw on the way here someone who had been focus grouping there who said that all the swing voters said they weren't going to vote Tory. I mean, it seems sort of crazy, but I guess they did lose North Shropshire, which was a 23,000 majority. And then in the north, they've got Wakefield, which I'll come to as well. So I think it's a difficult period. I think in the Queen's speech, Boris Johnson's argument, and I think this is the one we'll hear, is to kind of say, well, give me a break. 2 years have been hell. We've had COVID, we've had Ukraine, and anyone would be in a difficult situation right now. Give me the next 2 years to try and pull this around and lift it up. The question is, what's he actually going to do with that? I mean, every MP says cost of living is coming up on the doorstep. They're under massive pressure to act. I mean, you'll know this better than me, so you'll probably know the answer to this, but as of now, all the mood music I still get from the Treasury and from Number 10 is that they don't want to do a massive fiscal measure before October, and if anything, they want to pre-announce it. So that's the South. That's kind of the most difficult, I think, thing for Boris Johnson right now, particularly because I think MPs can be ruthless, and if they think they're going to lose their seats, then they're not going to be that kind to their leader. And particularly on the Conservative side, I think they're prepared to move. But on the other side, you've got the north of England and the Midlands, and I think this narrative can be overdone. The results were not as good as the Tories sometimes make out. And that's partly because a lot of the elections were last up in 2018. So you have to compare them to when Labour actually did very well in the local elections rather than to when Labour tanked in 2019. So to give you an example, Wolverhampton Council, they stood completely still. And that is actually major progress for the Labour Party, and enough progress probably for them to take back a red wall seat there, which is Wolverhampton North East. They also did very well in places like Rossendale and Cumberland, where they all have Tory seats that the Labour are targeting. All that said, Labour didn't do well enough in the red wall, and they actually lost quite a lot of the Tories made big gains somewhere like Newcastle under Lyme. That's quite an important area. It's not only a red wall seat that they took in 2019, it's on the border of Stoke, which has got 3 very important seats that weren't up, and I don't think it's a coincidence that that's where the Cabinet are today to do their Cabinet away day. I think that's the type of seat that they know if they can hold, then it's not going to be enough progress for the Labour Party. I'll come to Labour in a second, but just in terms of one other thing I thought about why and how Boris has remained in place and looks like he's not going anywhere soon, is that they've had a kind of extraordinary what was it called? Operation Save Big Dog. I never actually figured out if that was actually true or not, the name. But that's what it was. It was Operation Save Big Dog. Never mind if some other people go. And it's quite like forensic. Grant Shapps is there, I think, with his amazing spreadsheet, which really understands what every single MP in the Tory party is thinking. I've spoken to an MP who was totally under the radar, who did tell me that he'd put a letter in of no confidence and thought, who would ever think about him? And honestly, you wouldn't. I doubt you'd know who he was. And he said the Prime Minister sidled up to him at something and was like, so tell me about that letter you put in. And the thing is, Graham Brady will never ever tell anybody about letters. So this is their own number 10 intelligence that knows what all these MPs are doing. And I think one thing that happens is when the momentum shifts, then the MPs shift with it. If you think Boris Johnson's going to survive, then you've got to be on his side and you've got to go out and bat for him. So that's them. So let's just talk about Labour, though, for a little bit, because, like I say, I think Labour did very well, obviously, in some places. It was a good election. They will be buoyed by the results. They'll be very happy with London, very happy with Worthing and Southampton, and those seats that I mentioned in the Red Wall. They'll also be pretty happy that they made some progress, not enough, in Scotland. They think that could be the type of progress that could win them back seats. All that said, in order to get a majority, Labour needs to win 123 extra seats, right? 123. So they don't only have to win all the seats back in the Red Wall, they have to win 50-odd seats across the rest of the country, and they have to make a recovery in Scotland. Those local elections do not suggest that they're going to do that. It suggests that they could force a hung parliament. If they force a hung parliament, of course, there's quite a major majority probably that's against the Conservatives, so we're going to be talking about coalitions, and I'm sure that the Conservatives in their campaign are going to be talking endlessly about coalitions because that sort of talk makes people vote Conservative. I saw it in 2015 and it was actually very powerful and is probably why they won a majority in 2015. The Labour Party is throwing everything into Wakefield. I mean, they've already had it up and running for a number of weeks. Their shadow cabinet is just continually going there. The local election results would suggest that they are going to win it back. I think if you have a situation in a few weeks where Labour win Wakefield and the Lib Dems win Tiverton, that's going to be quite a difficult narrative for the Conservative Party. But none of it is enough, as I've said, for Labour to actually win an election. And meanwhile, Keir Starmer has just put his entire career in the hands of the Durham police. I mean, I've spoken to shadow cabinet members to say, well, what do you think about that? Was that a good idea? Like, is he going to go? And they say almost everybody thinks that he will not get a fine. But almost everybody is very surprised that Rishi Sunak got a fine. And so they can't be sure. And even if there is a 1% chance, that is starting a little bit of jostling among other Labour MPs who would quite like to be leader, apparently. Or so I'm told. There have been some, as someone described it, warm approaches. I was like, what's a warm approach? Just didn't know what to think about that. Is that like a cuddle or what? But I think they basically said, like, very suddenly text messages from the people who might want to be leaders saying, oh, you did brilliantly there. Fantastic. Well done. Now, I'm not saying that any of those texts came from these people, but these are the people we might be thinking about, should there be a leadership campaign. Lisa Nandy, Rachel Reeves, Yvette Cooper, Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, even if she does get a fine and also has to quit. I don't know how she quite does that, but maybe that works. So overall, like, where does this leave us? I think it leaves us with everything to play for in the next election. I don't think it's guaranteed that the Conservatives are going to win, but I certainly don't think it's guaranteed that Labour can force them out either. In policy terms, I mentioned what I think Boris Johnson's push is going to be. It's going to, it's that pivot. We've had 2 really difficult years. Can we focus on the next 2 years doing this? The slight difficulty one MP said to me is, normally, in normal times, whenever they were, the first 2 years are spent making difficult decisions, and those difficult decisions pay off in the final 2 years. There's nothing to pay off here, because what we're actually doing is heading into an even worse cost of living crisis. He wants to level up, and I think he genuinely feels really passionately about that. I'm sure many of you are part of the people who are going to try and make that happen. And if you make it happen, fantastic, wonderful. But a bit of difficult news for them today from Bloomberg, who've done a really good analysis on levelling up, and it looks like there's been some levelling down over the past 2 years. And also, no offence if you wrote the Levelling Up white paper, I thought it was really interesting, but it's incredibly broad. Like, that is an incredibly broad aim to have, to basically improve everything in society across the country in a way that gets rid of inequality. It's a good aim to have, but it will be very hard for him to prove it in a couple of years. And the other thing I think he's really passionate about, by the way, which I really think deserves credit, because I used to be an education correspondent years ago, and the one thing that's really not sexy and really hard to get in the papers is skills. And I feel like this government is really passionate about skills and wants to really focus on it. So I think that's a good thing. I think for Labour, the kind of the thing that worries some people, including in the shadow cabinet, I think there's a bit of a divide in Keir Starmer's office, I think it would be fair to say. There are the people who are doing the strategy, who are very focused on focus groups, and there are people who are not entirely convinced that that's the best way to come up with a strategic vision, and who think that the party needs to be much more forward-looking and much more positive about what they're going to deliver. But I'd say overall, they're all in a fairly good mood at the moment, despite the whole Durham police thing, which is quite bad. But there's definitely tensions there. In policy terms, one policy which I think is very, very, very popular for them right now is the windfall tax. And I think that actually is very difficult for the Conservatives, because they're saying this would disincentivise companies from investing. But BP say we'd invest anyway. And, you know, we had Sharon White on John Lewis chair on Peston last night, and she was in favour of a windfall tax, and she was saying the cost of living crisis is as bad as the COVID crisis, and it requires a similar response. We also heard something similar from John Allen, who's the Tesco chairman, the other day. That's most of what I wanted to say, but I want to just give you two final thoughts on things that I guess affect you guys quite directly. One is the Rwanda policy, which obviously, Dave, you've been quite outspoken about, and you know, it's obviously affected people here. The more I think about this policy, the more it doesn't surprise me that it had a ministerial direction, because it feels to me that it's entirely about political framing. And two cabinet ministers actually said to me they would be surprised if anyone got sent. In fact, one said less than 2% chance of deportations, and they think it's all about the language. I think they are going to actually try and send a few people, but the point being, it's not really about sending people to Rwanda. And the thing that made me realise just how political it was when the story that had been briefed onto the front of the Daily Mail on the day of local elections was lefty lawyers trying to block our Rwanda plan, which I thought told you a lot. The second thing is work from home, which I imagine is a little bit of a sensitive issue here. I just wanted to tell you that we had Jacob Rees-Mogg on the programme last night, and you know, for you, I got some really good data to put to him, which was showing that when they had a survey of 28,000, I think it was 28,000 responses over 8 months, asking people how productive they were at home and in the office, 40% said more productive at home. 45% said the same, and only 15% think that they are more productive in the office. When I put this to Jacob Rees-Mogg, he genuinely turned around and said, I think people are lying to the survey, which was maybe the question that I needed to leave you with, because I'm sure you've got some things to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really good. Thank you. Really interesting. So, do we have any questions? Yes. Take Mark there, please, and then just keep putting your hands up.
Thank you very much for that analysis. Given the mountain that Labour have got to climb, what are you hearing about discussions between the other opposition parties? Because the Daily Mail said there was a pact, and that was being denied. But in some constituencies, if I live in Wales, or if you live in Scotland, you've got 4 progressive parties against the Conservatives who are sort of knocking each other out. So I just wondered if you've got any local intelligence about anything going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I can tell you what I know. What you'll never get is a formal pact, first of all. It doesn't really work because, you know, Labour fight the Lib Dems, for example, in parts of the country. You know, take Hull, for example, where the Lib Dems took the council from Labour. But what you definitely have are informal pacts. I'll just mention Scotland in a minute, because I think the biggest one is Lib Dem Labour. And it's important to remember how important the Lib Dems are to a Labour recovery. You know, I said I was on the Cameron bus in 2015, and it was a Linton Crosby run election campaign. And I was only on the bus 50% of the time, so my experience isn't a perfect map of what David Cameron did in that election. But I would say I spent over 90% of my time in Lib Dem seats in the southwest, including twice visiting Yeovil and twice visiting Twickenham, which I have to say I said to Conservatives on the bus, I can't believe that you think you're going to win those seats. And they were absolutely convinced they would. The way the Conservatives won a majority in 2015 was to kill the Lib Dems, which arguably was quite ruthless given they just prop them up in government for 5 years. But I guess politics is ruthless and across all parties. And the reason that's important is that if the Lib Dems can make a recovery in the southwest, and it now looks like maybe they can a bit, although locals, generals, got to be careful, then that mountain gets quite a lot smaller for the Labour Party. Now, in terms of pacts, I think North Shropshire was probably your best example of it. On the ground, it felt as if Labour were going for that seat quite hard, local Labour. The candidate really wanted to win it. The candidate was not in a pact with the Lib Dems. As far as the national mood went, they barely did anything. They didn't send Keir Starmer. I think Angela Rayner did go. Maybe that was because of a link to the local candidate. And whenever I asked them what's going on here, because I was making a piece about it, I was trying to decide what was my tone. Some of my team were saying Labour are going really hard. Should we be doing Labour? I was like, no, I think it's a Lib Dem Tory fight. And sometimes it's difficult to analyse because the Lib Dems came third in North Shropshire. But the thing you have to understand is that in a seat like North Shropshire, Labour have a ceiling. Loads of people will never vote for Labour, but lots of Conservative voters might vote Lib Dem. And that's why, even though the Lib Dems were nowhere, they were able to take the seat. So I would call that a pact of sorts, right? Nationally, Labour are having nothing to do with the seat. They actually said to me, we've got no chance of winning it. We're not throwing any resource into it. And I suspect you'll see the same thing from the Lib Dems in seats where if they step back a little bit, Labour will come forward. There will be seats where it's very difficult to decide who gets that pact, like Wimbledon, for example. Is that a Labour or is that a Lib Dem seat? Who should be gunning for it? But yeah, I think there's that. I do not think there'll be any pact with the SNP because Labour are directly facing them. I also think the SNP is a real headache for the Labour Party because should they come to a coalition or supplying confidence and supply, whatever the right way around is, first of all, I think the Lib Dems would be much more tempted by confidence and supply because they got destroyed by the previous coalition. Secondly, if you do a coalition or even any deal with the SNP, you probably need to give them an independence referendum. If they then win that independence referendum, it's got major long-term implications for Labour as a party. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's a bit of a catch-22 for them. But yeah, lots of pacts, informal pacts in the south, I imagine.
Thank you. And Sarah over there had a question. And then I'm going to one online. So if there's anybody else in the room, just keep sticking your hands up.
Hi, Sarah Shisak from DWP. You talked about Sharon White, used to work with us, talking the cost of living crisis as important as COVID crisis, and a third crisis that we here talked about, but you didn't mention, and this probably reflects, the attention given to it in Parliament, the climate crisis. What would it take to get politicians more interested in doing something about that? Even we've got a war in Ukraine, energy strategy. You could, sort both of them by reducing demand. Nothing in the energy strategy.
Okay, so I'm going to be quite. I led on our coverage for COP26, and I think it dwarfs all other crises in the long term. In the medium term. And the one thing I would say is this is a Conservative government, and you might think traditionally from the right people are less interested in the climate crisis. I think Boris Johnson is really interested in the climate crisis. I think that he does care about it. I don't think it was disappointing at COP26 that he decided that domestic issues in the end meant he wasn't going to come back for the end, and I thought that was a disappointment. But I thought Alok Sharma did a good job. I know the narrative wasn't always that positive. I know that India said some negative things at the end, but from everyone I've spoken to in the sector, it felt like that was as far as COP26 could have taken us. And that even though we don't count, even though what really matters are the climate plans to 2030, that the fact that 70 or 80% of the country is now under net zero targets, slightly longer term, is impressive progress. So Boris Johnson's under massive pressure on the green agenda because certainly a lot of his MPs think get rid of green levies and that's something we need to do. So we asked him about it. I went to India with him a few weeks ago. Again, I've no concept of time. And on the plane, we asked him about it. And he said there's a lot of discrimination against the green agenda. And I'm not having any of it, basically. And he made his argument for why net zero would remain in place. And the energy security strategy, again, you'd probably have a better opinion on this than me, it's not very good for short-term consumer fixes for the cost of living crisis. And I was very surprised that it wasn't. I was very surprised it didn't do more on insulation and more on the short term on energy bills. But it's pretty good on long-term net zero targets. No? I mean, you probably, like I say, have a better view than me. I felt genuinely at COP26, when I was looking at all the strategies of countries around the world, that we could be doing a lot worse. And that the story of COP26 we did do it, by the way. I did do a bit of, are we doing enough on net zero? Because I think if you're going to host the conference, you've got to be greener than green. But we are not, my view was, ultimately, we're not the problem here. Ultimately, the US is a major problem, possibly even a bigger problem than China, and China is the other major problem. So I mean, don't get me wrong, I think we should keep the pressure up. I think it's more important than anything else. I think Boris Johnson could easily be knocked off where he is at the moment, but it is quite a positive thing that a Conservative Prime Minister just 2 weeks ago, under pressure from his MPs, was willing to defend the green agenda, and that the energy security strategy is at the heart of his Queen's speech going forward. Someone in the Climate Change Committee, quite senior, said to me, in a way, they quite like it when the Conservatives are the one making the changes on the climate, because Labour then tried to outperform them from the left. Whilst if you had a Labour, not that they were saying there was anything wrong with a Labour government from a climate perspective, but if you have a Labour government in, the risk is the Conservatives try to undercut them, which I thought was quite interesting.
Thank you. I'm going to take an online question, if that's all right. And it's a question about, do you think the breakup of the UK is more likely following the recent local elections, in particular the Northern Ireland results and the apparent reinforcement of the independence vote in Scotland?
I mean, definitely more likely, but that may still not be massively likely. Is that a way to say it? I mean, I slightly, but sometimes my colleagues disagree on this, I slightly shy away when we're discussing Northern Ireland, and I'm not an, complete expert on Northern Irish politics by any means, from immediately jumping to the idea that what we're looking at here is a reunification poll. Like, the Good Friday agreement was hard fought for, and of course it does have allowances in for a reunification poll, but at the same time, both sides there want to try to maintain peace, and everybody knows the instability that would come if you head towards a referendum. And there are other things that nationalists want at the moment, and that unionists want at the moment, which need to be solved. All that said, I think we're in a period of deep instability in Northern Ireland, which is actually kind of terrifying. It's a really technical discussion that they're having about the border checks between GB and NI, and you just look at what they're kind of threatening on both sides and think, oh my goodness, what are we looking at here? At the moment, to the unionists, we've put a border down the Irish Sea, and that is completely unacceptable to them. But Seckovic, has just responded, so I've just been reading it on my phone, to Liz Truss after it. They've had a meeting just now, and he's basically said, if we have unilateral action in the UK, then that would threaten Northern Ireland's access to the single market. So that's essentially a response saying we could be looking at a hard border on the other, on the island of Ireland. And I always think with these European negotiations that at some point everything just does calm down, and a lot of it's kind of overheated, and you do get there. But I think we've got some bumpy times ahead, because it sounds to me from I've been trying to talk to negotiators on both sides, that there are some pretty clear red lines in place that make it very difficult. In terms of Scotland, I mean, one thing that I just pointed out, I mean, there's been a lot of support for independence all through the COVID pandemic, but I just thought it was interesting that whilst the SNP still did very well in the local elections, the current tracker polls for independence have no ahead. So at the moment, they're still not got a majority in the polling for independence. And I think the SNP will need to be very, very careful about when they go for a referendum, because if they were to lose again, then that would put them in a very difficult position.
I've been asked to allow the General Secretary to follow up with a question.
A couple of points on that. One, do you think that if Labour look potentially electable in the next election, we'll see a switch in Scotland from people who only 6-7 years ago voted Labour and switched to SNP, but gone back to Labour because they think tactically that is going to give Starmer or whoever's leading Labour at the time a chance. And so they just looking like you could win might actually drive a different vote in Scotland. Another thing I was going to ask more generally about, when you talked about this government, one of the things that seems to me about this government is it doesn't really have a vision. Everything feels tactical. Everything feels tactical about securing the vote and just keeping going. And the Rwanda policy is a perfect example of that. The working from home policy is a perfect example of that. It's what do they think is going to electorally work, rather than saying what actually are we going to do. And even their big agenda levelling up, as you say, there's a lot of aspiration in there, but there's nothing really kind of concrete around it. And is that really the nature of Johnsonism? Is it that kind of tactical, with some kind of direction, but no real sense of longer term vision around what they want to do in terms of transforming Britain?
Okay, so on the first point, I think, if Labour has a mountain, I can't think what's bigger than a mountain. Whatever's bigger than a mountain is what they've got they've got the Everest in Scotland.
Ben Nevis.
They've got Ben Nevis, okay. They've got a very, very big mountain. I mean, they will be very hopeful about a little bit of improvement in the local elections, and they'll hope that might mean a few seats come back. And obviously, there is always a chance that things change. Like, I think you'd look around the SNP and say, who follows Nicola? And are they going to be as impressive as her? When I ask SNP MPs that question, they point to lots of MPs who they think are really impressive. So who knows? Maybe that's right. I think the thing that the Fabians did a really interesting research on the mountains that Labour has to climb, and they say there are 25 seats in Scotland where there is a clear majority against independence, but where the SNP are in power and have got the seat. And a lot of the SNP majorities are not that big. And so there is some hope where you could get a kind of almost a tiny bit of a turn, which would actually swing a lot of seats. And actually, interestingly, that's what happened in England in the north and the Midlands. Theresa May actually won 1 million extra working class votes, but she just didn't quite turn the dial enough. And so she only won 5 seats. And it only took a tiny little twist beyond that to make all those seats fall. So I think that's what they'll be hoping for. Whether Anas Sarwar is breaking through enough, I don't know. I think that would be a difficult question. I mean, in terms of the government, does Johnson believe in... The kind of cliche is, does Johnson believe in anything beyond himself? I mean, it is clear that his ambition to remain in power is quite a big part of what is driving him. I'm going to try and be fairer and say that, and not be so cynical on levelling up. Like, I think he must really believe in that, or he wouldn't, am I being too fair here, do you think?
Does he believe it electorally, though? I mean, is that the point? Is it just because
the reason I mentioned skills is, if you believed in things that are going to help you get elected, you probably wouldn't focus on skills. And I know that Nadeem Zahawi has been told that what the vaccine was to his career in the first half of this election should be what skills are to his career in the second half. And you talk to people in the DfE, they know that skills, I mean, I'm sure if there's people here, it's not a very easy sell. And so if you want to give them credit, then you'd give it to them for that. If you'd want to kind of look the opposite way and be cynical about it, then you'd say that there is a culture war brewing here, and that they are kind of cynically using that culture war to try and win votes, particularly in the Red Wall, for example. So Rwanda was all about the Red Wall. I've had about 10 Red Wall MPs say to me, the boats coming into Dover are basically the number one issue for us in the constituency. They've all been into meetings with Boris Johnson since Operation Save Big Dog, and they've told him, sort out the boats. You need to sort out the boats. Now, the real way to sort out the boats is probably quite complicated and different, but this is an eye-catching policy that they know is going to get headlines. So I think my kind of quite crap answer, is it's a mixture of the two. I think they are ruthlessly ambitious. I think that a lot of it is about staying in power. I think a lot of it will be electioneering. I hope that they do really believe in the levelling up agenda, and that they see that as something that they're going to try to drive through. I do think it's hard to drive through, though, because it's quite broad.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got Josh, please, over there. And I've got the gentleman in the yellow jumper, and then there's 2 of you on the front. And hang on, let me just keep writing.
So I was just going to ask which members of the cabinet do you think are on the up, and what does that mean for the influence that their departments have across government and on other departments, particularly kind of on other junior ministers.
Sorry, say the end of that again.
So which members of the cabinet are on the up, and what does that mean for the influence that their departments have across government, and to influence the kind of the priorities of other departments, particularly whether they can influence junior ministers in other departments?
That's interesting, because a lot of people would view this cabinet to some degree as slightly weaker than your average cabinet. In that, I don't mean that in a sort of that the individuals are not fine at their job, but in the kind of, they're more like Johnson's people who he's put in place in different cabinets, rather than they're the people who are driving the news and driving the agenda. I know that there are individuals within that cabinet who are seen as quite impressive. So, you know, Ben Wallace has had, obviously, literally a good war, or a good 2 wars, I would say. One who you probably don't hear, you wouldn't think about, but I've had number 10 talk to me about recently, is Anne-Marie Trevelyan. So they really impressed by her. They also quite like Suella Braverman, who they've mentioned. They'll be very aware of who might, you know, in any situation like this, like is happening now in Labour, where you've got people jostling for position because you think there's a chance that the leader could fall. They're also very wary of other people. So they were very wary of Rishi Sunak, and the big conspiracy is how much did they have a hand in his downfall. I mean, sort of downfall. Obviously, he's still Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he's not looking like a likely leader at the moment. I think they see Therese Coffey as someone who's very stable and has kept. I think that their view is if you can keep DWP out of the news, then they're pretty happy. I don't know what they think of Priti Patel. It's interesting, isn't it? Because they obviously defended her through some really difficult periods. But I suspect she also quite fancies herself as a future leader. I suspect, I think there is some truth in the old put Liz Truss in the Foreign Office because then she won't be here. And then it turned out that foreign news was basically dominant for months. I think she's had a good war. I think a lot of MPs would have said to me previously, they weren't so sure about her, but she's probably grown in stature over this period. I mean, I think if you're thinking about future leaders, the people who are sort of, although I don't think that really is what your question is, but I think that some of those come from outside the cabinet. I'll tell you one person who is seen as impressive and a lot of MPs but thought if leadership stuff had come in January, it was too soon, is Nadeem Zahawi. I don't know what he's like to work with, but he's definitely popular in the Conservative Party. And popular with number 10. He's seen as having been pretty loyal. He's seen as having done very well on the vaccine. And I guess we'll see how he does now in schools. I mean, the one thing from a journalistic perspective, there wasn't any money with that white paper, which I know there was money in the spending review, as they would keep reminding me, but there wasn't any additional money. And so I do wonder if he's got enough money to do what he would want to do. Who else is there? There's a couple who get a bit of a rude write-up, but I don't want to say it because that would be rude. There are a couple who some think are a bit lazy, but I won't mention. And Alok Sharma, who I just mentioned before, I don't know what you thought, but the leaders across the world seemed really kind of warm to him at COP26, and I mean, when he cried at the end, but afterwards, you know, they would come out and they'd talk to us. It was a sort of absolutely bonkers thing to cover. Because you'd be standing in all these corridors and we were like, how are we going to make this interesting? And then Macron would walk past, and then Biden would walk past, and then Modi would walk past, and you were like, okay, this is how we're going to make it interesting. We're just going to chase world leaders around a conference centre. And at one point, I actually got Biden actually reply to me. And the doorstep is the best thing in television news. You know, it's like, will they reply to you? Will they say anything? And just after Biden replies to me, you can hear me on the camera going, yes! But yeah, they were all really, really warm towards Alok Sharma. I'm trying to think, who else have I missed? I always don't like not talking about women. There must be other good women in there.
Oh, definitely. Shall we have another question though instead? Yeah. Casey, yeah. The chap in the yellow jumper. We got a microphone, please.
You touched a little bit on culture wars and on the desire for political parties to remain in power. You know, looking at US politics, the Republicans are making quite a good fist of staging a comeback. Are there warning signs in that political environment that we should be looking out for when we have a government which is capable of pushing through any agenda it wants with its current majority?
I think there are a lot of echoes between what's happening in America and what's happening here. Like the realignment is quite similar. I actually did the data on the US election for ITV News on the night in front of a green screen with my moving American map. So I had to obviously I understand American politics, but, you're trying to go up against people who've steeped in it for years and years. It was quite hard. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the Midwest was quite like the Red Wall. And what's happening in places like Arizona and other, Georgia, like different parts of the kind of southern belt, also they're not the same, but they kind of reminded me about some of the things that we're getting, particularly around London here. I think one warning in both directions is what I started by saying, is that these parties were born to represent certain voters. And to suddenly break those ties and not represent those voters is a very difficult thing to do. Like, the Democrats cannot be the party of Arizona and not the party of the Midwest. And Labour probably cannot be the party of Canterbury and not the party of, the North and the Midlands. And I suppose the thing that they need to be thinking about there is, if it's not Biden who's going to be up against perhaps Trump at the next election, then who is the person who can also maintain those really important areas around the Midwest, for example. And that's a similar challenge here. Although I hope that the answer to that doesn't mean they just keep choosing white men.
That would be nice.
Sorry to all the white men, I think,
Thank you. I've got a number of questions, and I think I'm only going to have time to take one. So can I just take one from the front, please? Yep, because you haven't... Can you pass it along? Thank you. And then I think we'll have to draw it to a close.
Hello. Adam Russian from the Fast Stream section. Just wondered how you go about cultivating and maintaining your sources on Westminster and kind of taking the pulse of the parties. You kind of mentioned quite a lot of conversations you've had with kind of people in the parties. And how much of that is a proactive effort on your part, or they come to you?
Unfortunately, way more a proactive on my part, although if anyone wants to come to me anytime, my DMs are open. And by the way, civil servants are the hardest people to get to know, which I do find frustrating, because the one area where I really do agree with Dominic Cummings is a lot of civil servants run the country, but we don't get access to them as journalists. But anyway, that's another bugbear. What you do it by getting to know everyone. So when I first joined the lobby in 2009, I just emailed a load of, or in fact I think I was writing letters at the time, a load of MPs who I thought were interesting, who had just come into power, who I thought were up and coming, and they were up and coming. It was people like Liz Truss, like Sajid Javid, like Nadeem Zahawi, like all these newbie MPs. You get to know them at that time, and then you keep getting to know them and you stay on it, and then you still know them when they get junior minister roles and Minister of State roles and cabinet minister roles, although they talk to you much less the more senior they become. But those contacts matter. And I went out to do my podcast for a few years. When I came back, I emailed every single 2019 new Tory MP and had coffees with as many as I could. And you just have to keep constantly having those conversations and building those relationships. And it is sometimes difficult because we cannot be friends with our contacts. And I'm sure the same is vice versa. But we do also have a relationship where you want to get on with each other, where you want to have a good, where you want to be able to have a good relationship, where they can trust you and you can trust them. And walking that line is probably at the heart of what makes political journalism quite difficult. And some people get it wrong. I hope, touch wood, I've got it right.
Thank you. I'm going to draw it to a close there. I'm sorry for those of you who haven't been able to ask you questions, but we need to keep to time. Thank you so much, Anushka, for coming to speak to us. I have a little problem when people talk about Operation Big Dog, because it just reminds me of Clifford the Big Red Dog. Because I've had 4 children and we've had those books in the house, so every time it's said, I just keep thinking Clifford. There we go. But everything you've said is just been really interesting, and we've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much indeed.